So yeah, in terms of the agenda for today, we've got Alan is going to speak after myself once I give this kind of broad introduction. And then we have David as well, and Hope is joining us online. So she's going to do a hybrid presentation for us. And then we'll have some Q&A kind of afterwards up until 2:30. And then in the afternoon session, we will be going on from what do we mean by public pharma into the more kind of call to action about how we might action some of these things with Chris, Keir, and Alison. So just to kind of highlight for those who aren't aware, this is an event that the People's Health Movement in Scotland are co-organising with a group known as the Scottish Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group. A couple of those people are joining are online as well. So it's a small alliance of academics, NGOs, trade union movements to try and get a wellbeing economy back on the agenda in Scotland. So it's something for the last few years has been on the agenda, but in the last couple of years, we've lost a minister for a wellbeing economy in the country. And so it seems to have kind of fallen down the pecking order, if you like. And we're keen to get that up again. So we had a webinar from Gary McCartney last month, and again, giving an overview of what a wellbeing economic strategy might look like. We've got the public pharma event today. And then I'll kind of formally announce it kind of later on, but we've got Milena Books from University of Leeds is going to speak in December, on the 4th of December, 3rd of December, I think that's it, about how to pay for a wellbeing economy. So just a highlight of some of those sessions that we've talked about. So I thought it might be useful for those who aren't aware of the People's Health Movement and the People's Health Movement in Scotland. They were a health activist network or movement, particularly focused on public health and health inequality as areas that we want to improve in the country. But we do this both locally in terms of localised action, say around Glasgow or Edinburgh, as some of the cities that we live in, but also the Scottish and the UK level, and then obviously within the global level as well. And a number of the people in the room today and joining us on the call are from PHM across Europe and globally as well. In terms of the activities that the PHM Scotland group has particularly been involved with, a number of different kind of reports that we've contributed to, and the likes of the Global Health Watch, consultation responses, holding health assemblies like we are this weekend, different kind of events and hearings, as well as writing a manifesto, which again is part of the activity we've got tomorrow, and a hustings event, which we ran back in, I think, 2017, and we're planning another one next year as we've got Scottish elections in 2026, which is why I think this is an area of interest for us. So I'm going to move on to hand over to Alan in a second. I'll try and monitor the chat on Zoom, so if people want to put questions in the chat as we're going, please feel free to do so. But I think we're going to hold questions until all the presenters have spoken, and that way it's easier to kind of have a bit more discussion. Hopefully we can get it working. So, but thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for joining us on Zoom, and I'll hand over to Alan.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today here. It's an honor to speak with you about this very important topic for PHM, for us. And my presentation basically has the role to put everyone on the same page, basically speak a little bit about what is public pharma, why it's important for us, and what we are doing about that, just to introduce the other presentations. So I'll try to be quick because I have only 10 minutes to talk about all of this, but feel free during the Q&A to clarify anything that's not clear enough. But before we start, just for me to have an idea, who has already heard something about public pharma? Some of you can't, okay, yeah, you don't count here, yeah, yeah. Does not know what is public pharma? Everyone here knows what is public pharma? You don't know? Yeah. Who else? Okay. So just for me to have an idea. Before we start talking about what is public pharma, I would like to start with a quick conversation on the problems of the current system, so we can understand why we need public pharma, or why we need a change. Why is it necessary? So first we have to talk about big pharma and how it's a systemic failure. And here are some, we are going very quickly through these topics here because I think, unfortunately, all of us are patients, and we know very much what we are talking here about. So today, the problem we are facing is that we are facing health dependency on corporate interests, concentration of power in big pharma, exclusion of public and democratic participation, limited global cooperation, narrow biomedical dominance, misalignment between R&D, research and development, and public health needs, lack of innovation. Yes, because some people here believe that no, big pharma is like a star and always innovating and etc. But it's not the case. We have many studies. It's not just activists talking about that. We know that big pharma is not innovating, and privatization of public resources. Each of these topics could fill a full afternoon talking about that. And then you have even a second layer of this conversation. And here we have more, let's say, immediate preoccupations, for example, abusive prices. I don't even have to talk a lot about that. And shortage of health technologies, which is a problem all over the world, but also in Europe, as we all, if you are reading the news, you know that we are experiencing this problem today. Evidence bias, not based clinical trials, manipulations in drug prescriptions, unregulated and unsafe pharmaceutical markets, exploitative labor practices in the pharmaceutical sector, and finally, unsustainable environmental practices. All of this can be considered part of the systemic failure that we have today. If you have any questions regarding any of these points, I will be more than happy to discuss during the Q&A, but these 2 slides is just to prove that something is wrong or everything is wrong, and we need something else. We need a radical and a structural transformation of the system we have, and that's why we have to talk about public pharma. So now we are going to the second part of the presentation, where I'll try to make very clear what we understand as public pharma, and not only from a technical perspective, because as any other concept, this is a political concept. This is a political concept under dispute. And here I'm going to present you a perspective, a very specific perspective coming from the People's Health Movement. It's not the only one, but it's what we believe we should understand as public pharma to radically change that scenario that we saw. Because a radical problematic scenario as we have now requires a radical model to be transformed. And the best way to, based on our experience, the best way to explain our concept of public pharma is compare it with big pharma. If you are not aware of what is big pharma, trust me, this is a very accurate way to describe it. Large transnational corporations seeking profits at all costs. While for us, public pharma is completely the opposite. It's a long conversation about this definition here, but what you have to know is that for PHM, we believe that a true public pharma initiative should be state-owned and could be dedicated to research, development, manufacturing and or distribution of pharmaceutical products and other health technologies. And then quickly, we are not going in details into this point here, but just to present you that we could map the 3 different approaches to public pharma nowadays. The first one is the position of those who are against public pharma. Basically, they believe that the current system works fine as it is. The first 2 slides that we're talking about, but believe me, there are also people saying that it's fine. Some of them, they acknowledge those problems, but they say, well, they are justified, unavoidable, or acceptable. And some of them will say, okay, they can be solved, but the private sector is enough to solve it. So this is a first perspective on the public pharma topic. The second perspective is, in fact, a group of different perspectives that we are calling here for didactic purposes, varying degrees of neoliberalism. Some people who say, fine, the private sector is not enough, we need public pharma, but then we are calling public pharma something that could be included under the neoliberal paradigm, which would, in general, it would be that states are considered incapable or ill-suited to perform certain functions. And remember, for us, this is not the case. And secondly, that public pharma should be limited to addressing market failures. It means where big pharma is not interested in, the state or public pharma should step in and take on the responsibility. And finally, our perspective again. States play a central role in safeguarding the right to health. We are not afraid of saying this, although in the new liberal scenario we are living nowadays, this is not obvious. Maybe it can be in the constitutions of our countries, but it's not obvious to say that the state has a role to play. It's a responsibility, not a favor, and we have to demand this from the state also in the production of health technologies. But then, still talking about what is public pharma, it's fair to ask, okay, but is it some fairy tale model that does not exist in reality? What is it? And I'm glad to say that we have many, many, many examples around the world. Just to mention, for example, if we are not restricted to Europe, we can say, for example, that in Brazil, I'm from Brazil, by the way, we have more than 20 public laboratories could be considered public pharma. And in Europe, we have many, as you can see here, many concrete initiatives, like in Portugal, like in Sweden, like in Italy. I know that we have an Italian crew here, so we can talk more about that afterwards. And then here in Romania, and we also have some important proposals of public pharma initiatives. And this one in particular was proposed by MPLP, Medics for the People from Belgium, and we also have some representative here from them, and they are part of our coalition, Public Pharma for Europe coalition. And it's a very interesting paper that I highly recommend. So just for you to know that it's not something far away and impossible to reach. On the contrary, it's more feasible than and necessary, and I would even say unavoidable than we should initially consider. And finally, to use my last minute, I would like to share with you what we are currently doing regarding this. So first, why we need it, what is it, and now we have what we are doing as PHM regarding this. We believe that we have three main course of actions all over the world, including Europe. First, establishing new public pharma initiatives, and here you can see the importance of those proposals that I just mentioned. Protect the ones who are, that already exist, which are under attack they're under attack because of the new liberal context, and big pharma and even states, they are not happy with the public pharma initiatives. So we have to protect them and also to expand the ones that exist. So this is basically the three main course of actions that we have. And we are also PHM is also part of the Public Pharma for Europe coalition. Everyone should have one of these flyers here that I shared with you. It's very important for you to know that everyone is welcome in this coalition as an individual, as an organization, so as an academic, as an activist. The only thing, you can see more in the flyer and on our website and social media, the only thing is that we have a common ground. We have a plural perspective on what is public pharma, how we achieve that, etc., etc. But we all agree, the way the system works is not fine, and then public pharma is a strategic part of the solution. So I would like to invite all of you to be part of our coalition and be part of our activities. This is one beautiful picture that we had in Brussels in 2024 in our first conference. Spoiler, the second one is coming next year, so you are all invited to participate in Germany. And that's it from my side. I will be more than happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? So, what I really want to share with you today is tell the story about Dutch vaccine origin. one country, the Netherlands, built a very strong public vaccine tradition, and then gradually, step by step, lost it. It's not only a history lesson, it's really a story about choices. The earlier choices about treating vaccine as public good, the choices not to commercialize, to patent the inventions, and the choices really to spread scientific knowledge widely. But it's also a story about the later choices, the choices to privatize, to render their own vaccine sovereignty. So for me personally, it's very inspiring, this story, because it shows what solidarity-based science can achieve on a global scale, but at the same time sobering, because it shows what happens if public institutions are dismantled. What I want to emphasize here in the slide is the overall arc of the Dutch story. So the Netherlands, kind of for this century, was considering vaccine production as a core public task. And for several decades, it worked. The vaccines were produced as public goods and not commodities. But I think in the 80s, with neoliberalism, also the ground shifted. And you had more stringent regulatory standards. You have the global procurement rules that favored big pharmaceutical companies, and of course the biotech revolution. All this worked against the public lab. And the Dutch, they didn't want to commercialize, and that left them structurally disadvantaged. And by the 2010, you have the privatization that dismantled this institute. What we see here is this trajectory that's broken down by eras. So we have the earliest decades, where you have the 1919 Health Act that created state monopoly over vaccine production. After the Second World War, you have Marshall Aid that was used to build new facilities in Bilthoven as part of NATO preparedness. There was also a time in the 60s where Dutch bioengineers pioneered transformative bioprocess innovation that they shared widely. So they didn't patent it. It was also a time that it was decided that this institute got a mandate to produce vaccines that are the national immunization programs. After 1970, the institute got more internationalized. So it's collaborated with a lot of WHO EPI programs, expanded program of immunization that was meant to provide vaccines to the global population. From the 1980s on, as I said, the biotech revolution, and that meant that biotech firms, they were really pioneering disruptive technologies, such as recombinant DNA and conjugation technologies that were really essential in developing the new generation of vaccine modalities. It was also a time that the Institute struggled. It needed to collaborate with these biotech firms, and where a lot of different bacterial vaccine projects collapsed. Fast forward in 2000, and more specifically after 9/11, the vaccines were seen as strategic assets. And so there were funding, but it wasn't sufficient. And then you get privatization of the manufacturing arm, Bilthoven Biologics, and the Intravac, the R&D arm. And when the pandemic hit, then the Netherlands was fully dependent on multinationals for their vaccine supply. But let's focus on the concrete achievements. As I said before, you had the bioengineers who had this transformative bioprocess innovation, and more specifically, the microcarriers, and using a bioreactor approach. Both revolutionized the viral and bacterial vaccine production. Also, the Institute was a training hub. So it trained hundreds of scientists from low and middle income countries. And they went on to create their own national immunization programs. And then, of course, you have the technology transfer. And I will mention 3 of them. In Indonesia, the whole bacterial vaccine knowledge was transferred. Indonesia, a former Dutch colony. Then in India, the Institute was instrumental to have all the technical assistance that was needed to extend the vaccine combinations. And then in China, the Institute was essential in privatizing, and no, not privatizing, in just providing manufacturing capacity for 3 state-led companies. So actually, what I want to mention is that these achievements, they were all by an ethos of open science. And it shows clearly what a public good approach to science can achieve on a global scale. But one, of course, needs also to mention the failures, the decline. Just briefly mentioning, there was a project with the Dutch, where the Dutch Institute collaborated with other public institutes from Scandinavia to develop a pneumococcal vaccine. There were technical challenges. The protein were unscalable in clinical trials, failed, but also managerial challenges were reason that it collapsed. Secondly, you have the Haemophilus influenza beta pentavalent project that failed because the institute refused to go into a licensing agreement with a biotech firm, Praxis Biologics, who pioneered the conjugation technology. With the main reason, actually, that the institute was not a commercial vaccine production organization. And then the institute was also too late to start with an acellular pertussis vaccine combination, and this delay just made the Minister of Health in 2005 to be making the decision that they would be reliant on import from commercial vaccine entity. Meanwhile, you have the EMA rules, the European Medicine Agency rules, that mandated very costly phase 3 trials. And this was a hurdle that the public institute was unable to cross. And you have the privatization, and more specifically, the manufacturing arm, the Bilthoven Biologic, who was sold to Serum Institute of India, a pharmaceutical company in India. And Intravac, the R&D arm, was sold very recently at the end of 2023 to FDI Bioscience. So at the time of COVID, then it was painfully visible that Netherlands lost all capacity to produce its own vaccines. And it was totally reliant, as other European countries, on Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca to provide the vaccine supply. The Intravac, the R&D arm, had a homegrown Dutch technology based on outer membrane vesicles, and was a promising vaccine candidate, COVID vaccine candidate, that stalled after phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, just because they didn't have the funding for costly phase 3 trials. The Serum Institute of India, as you remember, I think in the previous slide, who bought the manufacturing arm, they became one of the largest vaccine supplier to the COVAX initiative, initiatives to provide COVID vaccines to the low and middle income country. Ironically, with the Dutch know-how. that was provided during a technology transfer project in the 90s. And vaccine sovereignty was handed over to the European Union. So what do we, as a civil society, take away from the Dutch story? Firstly, you had the Dutch public good ethos. That is very inspiring because it created vaccine commons. But in an IP-driven world, this solidarity-based model proved very fragile. Secondly, you have the privatization, a full entrenched dependence on multinationals. Then the financialization, thirdly, that made it really impossible for the public lab to keep pace. So there were not only the costly phase 3 trials, but you had also all the upscale to good manufacturing practice. And that really led to an exponential, increase of R&D costs to several hundreds of millions of euro dollars. So a sum that the public institute never had. And sovereignty, as I said before, it was reframed as something for the EU really to manage, and not something that the Dutch state was to protect. So I think the last line, I think, is the most important one. Also, as Alan already said, that it's really important to act to defend public pharma, the common-based R&D and vaccine sovereignty, because if we don't, then we will repeat the mistakes. So at the end, I can conclude that the story of the Dutch vaccinology is inspiring, but also cautionary. It shows what is possible if science is treated as public good. We have this world-class bioprocess innovation that was shared with everybody, with public producers as well as private producers. You had these training programs that empowered scientists from low and middle income countries, and you had the technology transfer that built a global manufacturing capacity. But it also showed what is at risk. If the vaccine production is sold, then vaccine sovereignty is gone. And then it's extremely difficult, even nearly impossible to reclaim it. So this, as I said in the beginning, this is a whole story. It's not a history lesson only. It speaks directly to the present. So currently, the European Union is debating the Critical Medicine Act. And on paper, it's about vaccine sovereignty and reliance. But the most important question is, of course, if this act will be used to rebuild some of the public manufacturing capacity, or if it will only be used to subsidize the firms under the banner of reliance. And again, if we choose the latter, then of course we will make the mistakes of the Dutch vaccinology. Also at the same time, the WHO and the member states, they are having actively working on an R&D commons style. Then we're talking about technology pools, but also technology transfer. And then at this moment, WHO is also negotiating the appendix to the pandemic agreement, the new pathogen access benefit sharing system, which issues such as pricing, technology transfer are being trashed out at this moment. So this initiative could be transformative, but they are highly contested. You have the pharma lobby, as well as very powerful states that want to keep IP protection, and market dominance intact. So today's battleground is about fighting on this initiative, to fight with this initiative, because at the end it will determine if the vaccines will be treated again as public good or just remain commodities in the hands of a couple of corporations. Today's battlegrounds is about that. And then at the end, I could say that the Dutch experience, it's clearly showing what is at stake and how quickly vaccine sovereignty can be lost. So very briefly mentioning that I'm also in debt to Jan Hendrik, who was a scientist and project manager in the institute, in the Dutch institute, and who wrote a very interesting paper in the book entitled Immunization and States, and a book that I highly recommend. Thank you, and then move on to questions.
So, thanks everyone for inviting me. It's really nice to be here with you. Sorry that I can't be there in person. I live in Norwich, so Norwich to Glasgow is quite a trek, but I'm really glad to be able to join you guys online. So yeah, I feel like other speakers have covered really well, kind of, I suppose, a bit more about what we mean by public pharma, what that can look like, and kind of examples of it in action in the past. I will focus a bit more on sort of like the patient angle and the UK context specifically, and I suppose how we're organising to fight back at Just Treatment. So yeah, there might be a little bit of repetition with the other speakers, but I'll try to minimise that. And yeah, I'll check out the chat afterwards, so feel free to put any questions in there for the people that are on Zoom. So firstly, who are Just Treatment? So Just Treatment was started in 2017. We're a patient-led health justice organisation, and basically we work with patients and families who have been directly impacted by various different kinds of health injustice, and we sort of support those patients and those families to we support them to lead campaigns to sort of fight for systemic change. So for example, you can see this photo on the right here. We've got a couple of our patient leaders, Matthew on the left and then Samina at the back. She's there with her 3 grandkids. Both of them very sadly lost family members as a result of ambulance delays. And so we've been working with them for a while to campaign around kind of life-saving investment into the NHS. And this was when we went with them to 10 Downing Street to hand in our petition. So we're kind of always trying to put patient stories, patient voices at the forefront of the work that we do. And specifically, we kind of focus on areas where patient power and corporate power kind of collide, which is happening with increasing frequency across our health system. And when it comes to big pharma, obviously patients are impacted by the kind of business as usual status quo of the pharma model all the time. So yeah, a lot of this has been covered, but just to sort of run through it. Obviously, the current monopoly-centered model for developing new medicines has lots of very disastrous impacts on our health in the UK and globally. So obviously, we've got a system where corporate profits are prioritized over patient health, a system where, you know, public research is kind of taken and patents are used to basically kind of lock away that research. Obviously, we saw, you know, just as an example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, it was revealed that that was 97% funded by the public, despite the fact that Boris Johnson wanted to say the reason we have this vaccine is because of capitalism and greed, and that's good, which is just an outright lie. So that's obviously a big problem. It then enables companies to hold lives to ransom. They abuse their monopolies all the time to basically keep hiking up the prices, and they prey on the fact that people are desperate. They're desperate to access the medicines that they or their families need. And of course, there's a massive kind of global inequity element to it, because these companies are basically interested in how they can maximize their profits. So this will tend to prevent access, especially in less rich countries, for example, in the global south, because companies will look at certain countries and say, we can't make any money there, we're not that interested. So throughout the years, we have supported cancer patients, we've supported hepatitis C patients, we've supported cystic fibrosis patients to fight for access to treatment in the face of big pharma greed. And in a number of cases, we have won. So I'm going to run through kind of one key example of that now for you guys. So the case study of life-saving cystic fibrosis drugs. So For those of you that don't know, although you probably do, cystic fibrosis is a life-threatening condition that impacts the lungs, and without treatment, patients often die as children and teenagers. There is a miracle drug that exists which can effectively give patients a normal life, and the US drug company Vertex Pharmaceuticals is the company that holds a monopoly on this drug. And so before 2019, this drug was not available on the NHS, which is the UK health system, because of how high the price was. So Vertex was charging £104,000 per patient per year, when we know that it can be made for about 1/20th of that cost. And very notably, Vertex played a very, very good PR game. They constantly blamed the NHS. So the CF community for a long time was just basically putting the blame on the NHS and saying, you know, basically parroting Big Pharma's line and saying, why isn't the NHS making a deal? Vertex pumped loads of money into lots of kind of patient associations, for example, basically to keep them quiet and to keep them in the pockets of Big Pharma. And that's why, just to say, Just Treatment, we're a patient-led organization that will never, ever, ever accept any money from Big Pharma or companies that are kind of destroying our health system. And so basically, yeah, we supported a group of cystic fibrosis patients and parents to lead a campaign to shame Vertex, essentially, and to call on the government to use what's called a Crown Use License, which is a mechanism that can be used to break the monopoly of a company like Vertex and allow in the production of kind of cheaper generics. And alongside that, we also set up what we called a CF Buyers Club, to basically help patients get access to a generic version of the treatment that was being made in Argentina at the time. So we literally went over with Newsnight. We had a bunch of patients come into Argentina, take some drugs themselves and take some back as well. But obviously that was a big challenge because, yeah, the drugs couldn't be imported. They were on the other side of the world. But I think that pressure led to, you know, increasing pressure on Vertex as a company, increasing pressure on the government. And throughout it all, we were led by kind of the power of patient testimonials. Our campaign was covered all over mainstream media. And you can see this photo on the right here. This boy is called Lewis. He has cystic fibrosis, and this is his mum, Christina. They were two of the people that were kind of at the forefront of our campaign. This is them going on This Morning. They went on This Morning about 3 different times. They were on loads of different kind of mainstream media outlets as well. And yeah, this public pressure basically led to the government kind of even just mentioning and discussing potentially breaking Vertex's monopoly, which funnily enough was enough for Vertex to return to discussions to agree a kind of lower price deal. We presume at a significantly cheaper price. However, part of the problem with this model is that it's so opaque and not transparent. So we still don't actually know what the final terms of that agreement were. We just know that they made a new agreement and the NHS accepted it. So that then meant that we got access to this drug on the NHS. This saved thousands of lives and showed the collective patient power can be leveraged to overcome the greed of pharma companies. But the fight is not over, because despite winning access in the UK, life-saving CF treatment is still not available in the majority of countries around the world. The current price tag set by Vertex Pharmaceuticals is $370,000 per patient per year. And because Vertex is only interested in selling the drugs in high-income countries where they can demand and win sky-high pricing agreements, that means that the majority of the world is kind of shut out. So basically, following on from the success in the UK, we've been supporting CF patients and families in countries all over the world to fight back. And we've been working to basically hasten the introduction of a new, genuinely affordable generic version, because unfortunately, the one I mentioned in Argentina, we've seen the price of that has kind of consistently gone up as well. So even though it's much cheaper than Vertex's version, it's also now still unaffordable for the vast majority of people. But I'm very, very pleased to share with you guys that last week, half of our team were over in America for the North American Cystic Fibrosis Conference, where we basically launched a revamped version of the CF Buyers Club, along with the announcement of a brand new generic drug, which is being manufactured in Bangladesh, where patent law enforcement is not required. And for every patient that can be treated with Vertex's expensive drug, 58 children can be treated with this new generic. So it's an absolutely massive breakthrough, which basically is going to save loads of lives. It shows how vital it is that our movement fights to overcome and break these monopolies by any means necessary. So yeah, really excited to share that news with you guys. So just to return to the UK context, we are facing a kind of new battle around drug pricing, which people here may be aware of. So basically, Trump and Big Pharma have been teaming up to pressure the UK government into accepting significantly higher drug prices. Trump's logic is that it's basically an America first approach where he says Americans are getting screwed, our medicines are really cost loads here. I'm going to basically bully countries around the world to accept higher drug prices so that we can decrease drug prices in the US. Obviously, it's flawed in so many ways, but first and foremost, because big pharma companies will never accept, in the end, they will never accept lower profits. They are always in the game of seeking ever growing profits. So, and you know, he has basically been weaponizing sort of trade tariff threats against countries like the UK and others to basically say, you know, if you don't accept this, we're going to slap massive tariffs on this and that. But as well as Trump kind of applying this pressure, we've also had the big pharma lobby has been consistently and has already been pushing for high prices in their kind of ongoing negotiations with Wes Streeting, the health secretary, and they have used their own kind of threats as well. So, for example, cancelling or pausing investment in the UK that's been done in a very suspiciously coordinated way, and also kind of casting doubt on the future supply of medicines in order to try and kind of scare the UK into accepting it. Very predictably, but very frustratingly, the UK government are basically caving to these demands. We're expecting a kind of formal announcement on that literally any day now. And it's not at all surprising given that Labour's approach in this area has basically been disastrous. So we've got kind of two things right now that are giving Big Pharma massively outsized power. One is kind of Donald Trump and the kind of global trade wars piece. But the second is Labour, the Labour government's own economic and health policies. They've basically just released this 10-year plan for the NHS in the UK that's just all about tech and AI, and, you know, medical companies are going to kind of like save us basically. And they're so driven by doing whatever it takes to get investment into the UK by these companies, whether it's big pharma companies, big tech companies, and kind of fueling economic growth. It's basically, yeah, incentivizing big tech and big pharma to invest here and therefore just doing whatever they want us to do and doing whatever they demand of us. So obviously this sucks and it's only going to end badly for patients. So kind of getting towards the end now. So the solution obviously is the public pharma model, as we've kind of spoken about. It, you know, demonstrates that alternative approaches can work, and we've heard a bit about this kind of in the previous two speakers' presentations. But you often get just relentlessly bombarded. We get relentlessly bombarded with this idea that it's the big pharma model as it is the only way to do things, and that's just absolutely rubbish. We need to kind of be able to cut through that and demonstrate that there are different ways of doing it. The public pharma model obviously curbs big pharma's power and their ability to hold lives to ransom. So, for example, we could, under a different model, implement compulsory licenses much more easily, for example. We can actually utilize the levers that are supposed to, in theory, be there to hold big pharma to account, but very rarely get used at the moment. We'd obviously have a model that's designed around the NHS and kind of global health needs and patients' needs rather than corporate profits, which is what we currently have. We'd also cut loads of ridiculous costs that there currently are with the existing model. So there's so much waste, for example, around like marketing, share buybacks, things that are basically there just to inflate what's in the pockets of pharma executives that just wouldn't apply or wouldn't be the focus in a kind of public pharma model. And finally, we'd also obviously build UK capacity and like green jobs. We'd be investing in British science. And there's definitely some parallels here in terms of the monopoly model that we're seeing increasingly around big tech. You know, companies like Palantir, awful companies like Palantir that are getting increasingly kind of embedded within our health system. And the problem is when you start relying on them too much, it's very difficult to then get them out of it and do something about it, because we're not actually building up the kind of technical capacity of the NHS, of the British health system, that could act as a counterweight to these kind of big companies. So yeah, there's loads of reasons why public pharma is necessary. So finally, in terms of how we're fighting back, just wanted to share a bit about that. So this is a photo of a petition hand-in we did recently with 38 Degrees. We handed in over 250,000 kind of combined signatures to the Department of Health, basically urging the UK government to not accept these kind of big drug price increases. We also wrote a letter to the Competition and Markets Authority, basically calling for an investigation into anti-competitive conduct by the pharma industry. So we're basically claiming that it's very suspicious and should be looked into that multiple kind of pharma companies cancelled their sort of like planned investment into the UK at a very similar time. And so we think that should be viewed as and kind of interrogated as anti-competitive conduct. We're obviously also briefing and lobbying MPs. We're building pressure in the media. These issues are sadly very underreported, or when they are reported, the media is often doing Big Pharma's job for them and just kind of parroting their lines about the fact that, well, it's expensive to make drugs and therefore it's legitimate for these companies to charge such a high price. And if we don't do this, then they'll all leave, that kind of stuff. We're obviously working with allies, particularly in the UK and the US. This is obviously not just a kind of like issue that ends at the borders of like one country. And it's important we all learn from each other. And finally, we're obviously also trying to build pressure with, you know, organizations like People's Health Movement, with so many other fantastic allies, to win a transformation in the system and try and make public pharma happen. Because even though the campaigns that we have fought and won have been around like one specific disease or one specific drug, our end goal is always, how do we use these wins to advance the kind of broader vision for public pharma? It's never just about one campaign. It's always about how do we get that kind of overarching transformation that we all need. So yeah, sorry, I think I went a bit over time, but I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions in the chat or from the room. Thank you.
Any questions for David, for Alan, for Hope, or more kind of general discussion point from anybody? I had to be the one at the back.
Thanks to all the presenters, fantastic, fascinating information. My question is, across Europe, are there political parties who, as part of their manifestos, have the promotion of public pharma as a key, area of? Obviously, we've got the Europe Party is recently launched in the kind of UK, and that's sort of come from the remnants of the Corbyn kind of led Labour Party in the UK, and they went to a general election with really progressive policy framework, which included things like free access to Wi-Fi, so seeing access to the internet as a public good. But it's always quite appalled that many of the kind of more established political parties do not seem to have what on the surface here would seem like a very, very strong case for a genuine public good in terms of, so I'm just interested to know whether there are parties in other countries outside the UK that are engaged with this agenda. Thank you.
Is it easier to pass it?
Pass.
Well, I can start with this one because I think it's a very, very important and practical question. Of course, I don't have a full assessment of the whole Europe, and this is something that we should do collectively. Maybe in the second half of our event today, we could talk more about that. But based on my experience after more or less 2 years working on this subject, I can say that the political parties, including the left-wing parties, progressive parties, etc., they are navigating in a very dangerous neoliberal consensus. And when we are talking about pharma in specific, they don't have very creative solutions to that. And usually they astonishingly agree with right-wing parties with the topic of reshoring, nearshoring production to Europe, but in the end, always relying on investing more money in the private sector, which is going to be translating more money to the shareholders. So one of our tasks is to raise their awareness to this problem, because this is undermining their credibility with the public, in our opinion. But finally, I must say that there are some exceptions to that. And there is a very interesting initiative, just to mention one, in Switzerland, the Socialist Party, they have a concrete proposal on that. And they are even suggesting that officially suggest that the Swiss government should buy a facility and to run a public pharma initiative by the facility from the big pharma. So it's an interesting case, just to mention one. But it's in our to-do list, and we should do it together.
Any other inputs?
Thanks, that's a really interesting question. Alison McCallum from Edinburgh. I was just going to say that the other thing is to look creatively for allies, because the chair of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, the EU, Lee Anderson from Finland, has basically got together the group to think very creatively about workers' rights, about platforming, about AI and so on, for the benefit of the population. So I think there's an opportunity to have an angle to have that argument about public pharma and the benefits it could bring to that committee, and not just to stick to health, where what we're seeing come out from the EU at the moment is a bit disappointing.
Yeah, we've got a question on Zoom. And up, Els, do you want to unmute your microphone?
Hi, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the great presentations. I have a question for David. The case you present about the Netherlands is really fascinating, but very little known. And I'm wondering what exists in terms of publications. What can we do more to build that case? Because we often are bumping into the kind of there is no other alternative, the private sector. I mean, all these arguments, but having historical examples, not just Cuba, Brazil, etc., but in Europe or Canada, which I understand is a bit in the same situation. I think it would help us convincing politicians that it's actually not such a far-fetched idea, that actually it was the case in a number of countries. And the more we can document that and have these examples ready at hand, and a bit of a critical analysis of why they ended up being privatized, and showing that these are for the wrong reasons, not for reasons that have actually contributed to either public health or have destroyed sovereignty, etc. I think it's something that we as academia, civil society need to invest a little bit in, and because I think it will help building our narrative. This is not some kind of far-fetched idea. We used to do it like that, in particular on vaccines, and we could do it again, and on drugs as well. That would be my thing.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, I fully agree with you saying. I don't know what to add, because it's true. I think it's very important really to look at at history in a way, and definitely also in the US they are they have a tradition of probably decades actually to have the state provide manufacturing capacity. So I agree with you. It's really to hopefully raise enough awareness of these initiatives. But I would also mention, I think during the presentation, that I just tried to depict a kind of nuanced picture that it's really also, you know, because of the regulatory standards that are raising. Yeah, and I think also from the Ministry of Health, because they get blocked grants for the institute, because they considered it actually at just as cost instead of seeing really, you know, producing vaccines as a strength. And yeah, I think, yeah, I hope I answered kind of your question.
Any other questions in the room? If you want to introduce yourself.
It's Federico from Italy, medical student. I wanted to ask Hope from the treatment about how have you dealt with, or how do you deal with ethical aspects of, let's say, mainly the aspect of dog cutting, meaning that, for example, we have a situation in Italy where the majority of the public sector's funds go to Tiva, the Israeli industry. So I wanted to ask if you have an overlap with, let's say, boycotting, how you practice and deal with the ethical aspect of cost cutting, because many times Tiva offers like a generic drug that is much cheaper than the other competitors.
Thank you so much. I heard like half of that, but I don't know if maybe the host could just sort of repeat the first bit. I think it was a question about Tiva, is that right?
Yes.
And what, sorry, specifically, what is the question?
Not sure I'm the best person but try again.
And just try to repeat. How do you deal with the ethical aspect of the cost cutting part? Meaning that, for example, in Italy, we have Tiva, which access a lot of public funds in the national health system because they have much cheaper prices than other competitors. So how do you deal with this part, trying to cut costs and also including the ethical aspect of boycotting, let's say, Israeli industries?
Yeah, I'll try my best to answer that. I feel like my boss, who does a lot more of the kind of like engagement with like people that actually work in pharma companies, would be better to answer it, but he's not here. But so I'm aware of I actually found out the other day about the kind of emerging campaign around Tiva. So that's definitely something that we'll kind of like look into. It's not something we're active on right now, but certainly just to kind of like reiterate that we don't see health justice as like distinct from like other forms of justice. Like obviously you have to take an intersectional approach, like climate justice, health justice, you know, these things are all connected. And so certainly, yeah, we've been kind of speaking out and like campaigning a lot around like the rights of Palestinian patients and Palestinian health workers and how horrifically they've obviously been under attack over the last 2 years of the genocide. So yeah, that's something that we haven't kind of actively campaigned around on yet, but I'm hoping to actually connect up with someone who's involved in the Boycott Tiva campaign. I suppose your wider question around sort of the ethics, yeah, like I suppose partly it'll probably be to do with like the kinds of conversations that we have like with these companies and the sort of motivation. So I know that Bexim Co, that is basically the Bangladeshi company that's made this new generic that we just announced last week. We've basically, it's not me personally, but my colleagues have been kind of in ongoing conversations with them for like many months, alongside kind of like allied access to medicines experts that we work very closely with as well. So there's kind of like a lot of different I guess I would say sort of like aligned stakeholders within that, where we're all kind of like on the same page about you know, the need to kind of like balance a lot of these kind of like ethical questions and ensuring that we're not in pursuit of cutting costs, that we're not just like inadvertently also kind of propping up like other forms of like injustice. That's definitely not what we're about. And so I think, you know, through that engagement with Bex & Co, I think we've kind of seen that they are genuinely motivated to want to get these drugs to patients around the world, and that they were willing basically to kind of accept. I mean, they're still making a little bit of profit on this drug, and this is a thing that we always said to Vertex, is that like you could literally charge $5,000 per patient per year, and you could still comfortably make a decent amount of profit whilst also making it something that then loads of people could accept. So it's not that this company is saying we're literally going to just break even, we're not going to make any money. They're still making some money, but it's just kind of massively scaled back. And you do find companies that are not as, I would say Vertex is a particularly egregious example of like, honestly, a very evil company that's just like, we will pursue the maximum possible profit that we possibly can endlessly all the time. So yeah, that, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of pharma companies are like that, but like there are alternatives that exist. So yeah, it's a really good question. I hope I've like answered it to the best of my knowledge. As I said, I haven't sort of been in a lot of the meetings with like this company that we've been kind of liaising with around the generics. But yeah, you're certainly right that like we have to take a kind of broader view than just the like one drug and the one disease, because there's lots of other factors at play. So yeah, thank you for raising that.
So very good nodding along. So I think you have answered the question. So yeah, any other questions? We're gonna go Gillette, then we'll no.
Yeah, thank you so much for your inspiring thoughts. I also just want to respond to you. I'm Juliette from PHMNL and Europe, and I think as PHMNL would be particularly interested to bring the boycott Diva campaign within public pharma campaign that we are having. So we work on boycotting Teva, but not on public pharma as much as we would want to. So if that's a topic we are interested in to discuss further over the weekend. And then second, on starting with public pharma. So maybe my question is where to start. Which allies do you seek? Many of us work within universities. How can we build up from there when we want to discuss the public pharma, like setting it up within the country? We have a few comrades that are very knowledgeable about it, but we have also limited capacity within PHMNL. So what would be your advice as in whom to seek allyship with and how to start?
Anybody want to pick up?
Maybe we can, do you want to?
Do all the questions and then
You decide.
we can do the questions and then we can take a look.
I think we have 15 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you for the opportunity to ask. I'm Lisa. So I just saw a post of People's Health Movement and it captured me. So I really want to thank you for the presentation, but I do have a question in terms of the public pharma. Since you said you've also been to Africa, it was a private discussion, right? But do you think this concept can also work within that part of the world? Because my reason of actually wanting to partner is because I want to enable that the same concept can be taken to Africa. Because I've realized that, number one, we don't have access to certain medicine, not because we cannot make them, right? But there are so many barriers to entry that are within Africa that prevent us from actually making our own medicine and having it accessible to them. Not just medicine, but also diagnostic tests. There's a lot of HIV, there's a lot of malaria, there's a lot of everything. But we can't make our own. And at the same time, we are so dependent on big pharma for some of these products. And at the same time, accessibility is now limited. Not everyone has access to some of these drugs because not everyone can afford them. So do you think this concept can also work, in as much as you are trying to make it work here, can it also work on that other side of the world?
And then there was a question I think behind. Yeah.
your name again, sir?
Lisa. Hi, my name is Chris. I'm from T1 International. We work on access and affordability. I think my question goes to you, Alon, but we're seeing, especially in the insulin industry, the emergence of private-public partnerships within manufacturing. And I think I see a lot of problems with this moving forward. But do you think it is a worthwhile stopgap in the meantime until we can do a more sustainable public pharma model or more rights?
Maybe you can start and hope that they want to add something or anyone else, in fact. Well, I'll try to address the three questions very quickly. First, Juliet asked, what's the next concrete step and who are our potential allies or desired allies that we are envisioning right now? The concrete steps, first of all, we need everyone because we need influence the different areas of society. PHM specifically is more focused on our grassroots partners because we see that there is a potential avenue at high level advocacy. So I think we already have many good organizations doing this work, and also PHM is working directly there. But also we see that this fight, this struggle for public pharma really needs to rely on building real political power. And real political power will not come from more statements or more open letters. We need really to partner with people who are suffering from that. And it's very inspiring to see, for example, what Just Treatment is doing, because we think this is the right thing to do. And to build real political power, we need to broaden our scope and then to welcome our comrades from the health movement in general, and also people from the climate movement in general, and also unions and et cetera, So students of all areas, so we have been working on that. And the Public Pharma for Europe Coalition is the platform we are using to attract and coordinate these partners. So this is answering Juliet. And Lisa, right? Lisa raised a very important point because she asked if public pharma would work in Africa, or I would even say in Global South in general. And first, this is already working. We have many initiatives. And it's very important to raise that because this is the core belief, and this is the word belief of the new liberal era that we are in, that defends and propagates that the state is either inefficient or corrupt, even more in the Global South, and then they can't handle to lead initiatives like this. And we have to present counter arguments out loud to say this is not true. We already have initiatives that are working. And if we indeed lack capacities sometimes, we need to ask very clearly in a political way, not only in a technical way, to ask why we are lacking this capacity. And then we have to welcome historic discussions and also the way forward, not as a given data from nature that some states cannot afford to lead such initiatives. And a spoiler that we are organizing a conference in South Africa, Public Pharma for Africa, probably in the first semester of next year. So it's a good opportunity for us to keep in touch. And finally, Chris asked about PPPs, public-private partnerships, and this is a very important discussion that I'm afraid that I'm not going to address that in detail that it deserves. But the fact is that's also a very dangerous trap sometimes, because some people say, oh, perhaps this idea of public pharma is too idealistic, it's too difficult, because they buy this neoliberal discourse and they say, so maybe we should also rely on PPPs, public-private partnerships, as a solution, as a systemic and structural solution to the problem. Without that, and some people even try to label PPPs as an example of public pharmacy. These are two different things. So for us, very clearly, PPPs are not public pharma. Indeed, you need a public pharma to have a PPP, because then but what we have now is an imposition and not partnerships, in fact. So I defend that we don't have any PPPs almost, because what we have is an imposition of conditions from the private sector to the public sector. It's very rare when you have a true collaboration, a true partnership. And then I would say that public pharma does not exclude solutions such as this. For example, a wonderful solution that we have happening now in the US. Perhaps we are going to discuss more about that in the second half of our event. But this is not public pharma, and this is not the solution that we need right now. These are very important because it saves lives, and we have to make it clear. And we can include also the example that Hope brought from the just treatment campaign. It was not a public pharma solution, but we welcome it very, very much because it's saving lives. But in fact, we don't have to drop the long-term discussion that we have right now around public pharma.
David, were you on to bring it to Lisa?
Just answering about with Juliette's question. It's just also kind of seeing it because I'm a biomedical scientist and I worked 25 years leading projects on HIV and malaria vaccine development. And I must tell you, I don't know if I understood well the question. It was about, you know, in this current system where you have these academic centers, universities, this system actually, you know, they have their own technology transfer offices, where actually the inventions are just kept in university and they make money out of it. Royalties, fees. And I think that's probably, you know, the hardest is actually to convince scientists that actually there is also an alternative and it's not, you know, this exploitative, you know, pharmaceutical ecosystem, but something, you know, with more public interest and where, you know, it's not just fitting, you know, where at the end the pharmaceutical big pharma they claim ownership of the medical advances. So it's a hard thing, and it's really to try to raise awareness among also scientists in medical. Then going to you, Lisa. So I worked, you know, several projects in South Africa on HIV vaccine development. But then coming to it also with Alan, what he mentioned, I think there are some examples of this public pharma. For example, the WHO mRNA hub, the technology transfer hub, and that is trying actually to build some local public manufacturing capacity. I hope I answered the question. And then with the public-private partnerships, very few words. I agree with Alan that public-private, you know, as it tells it, it's also private companies that are taking, but there are some initiative, product development partnerships, where you have non-profit organizations such as the DNDi, who just have an end-to-end product development for neglected diseases. And still, I feel from that respect, even if private companies are involved, it has an added value. But I agree with Alan totally that it's just to fill the gaps, you know, that are left by big pharma because they are not interested. So, but you know, they have really their functions for development partnerships.
So we're almost at time. So I don't know if Hope, did you have anything to add to any of the points that were made just there? I know you put something on the chat about one of the blogs. If people can look at, I can share that kind of after the fact as well, if people want to go and view it.
Yeah, I was just maybe going to quickly pick up on the point about sort of how we build allies. Basically, I don't have anything to add on the other questions. I think David and Alan answered them really well. But yeah, I suppose for us, definitely having a kind of like diversity of like allies and therefore like a diversity of tactics is really important. Like we work with clinicians all the time. We work with academics a lot. We work with, you know, people that are involved in kind of more like parliamentary policy, but we can play a role that like many of those people can't. And so it's about kind of identifying what is the different roles for people to play within these coalitions, as long as there is a kind of like unified vision for what we're trying to achieve. And also through that diversification of tactics, you can also like push people further along. So for example, when we went to the North American Cystic Fibrosis Conference in 2023, we did an action outside the head office of Vertex Pharmaceuticals that was just like 3 CF mums, and that was kind of like it. We went again to that same office a year later, and we had like an army of 80 clinicians that were with us. And those clinicians, I don't think would have like taken that sort of direct action, that kind of protest action, you know, sort of a year or two ago. And so by kind of working in those coalitions, you can also, I think, push what's seen as like possible and what's seen as like the political common sense around these things. And then, yeah, the final thing I'd just say is about kind of following the big pharma lobby money and kind of like disrupting it, basically. Like I think trying to actually figure out where are these companies paying money to basically keep people on their side, and how can we kind of expose and challenge that. So my colleague Gail, who's a CF mum, who's basically leads our cystic fibrosis campaigning, she basically reached out to Just Treatment in 2018, I think, because she was desperate because her kid was dying, and she was like, we're not getting anywhere with this existing, you know, kind of form of protesting that we're doing, can you help? And through getting involved in Just Treatment, she learned so much about what's actually going on with the kind of big pharma model, the monopoly model. She was then outraged and was like, oh, so it's not actually the NHS's fault, it's this pharmaceutical company's fault. Was able to build a whole campaign around that we won in the UK. But then because she had that sort of politicization, she was like, I'm not done yet. I'm not satisfied. Even though my kid has access and the UK has access, I'm not done. I'm going to now expand and do this literally on an international level with patients in countries all over the world. And that kind of stuff is absolutely priceless. And that, I suppose, is an example of like Vertex's lobbying power being really kind of like challenged and disrupted. So I think like that's another thing I would say is like, how can we work together to kind of like, yeah, expose and challenge that lobbying that goes on, because that is a massive like dampener of like the progress that like our movement can make. So yeah, we need to fight it.
Very much. Cool. So yeah, so just before we finish up, I'm going to sort of share this slide again just for a second. Okay, so beyond just saying thank you. So just to, again, I mentioned it earlier, just to mention that we've got Milena Books is going to do a webinar linking into this, the Scottish Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group. So that's going to be on the 3rd of December, 12 to 1 GMT, and I'll share details to that for everyone that signed up for this event. If they're kind of interested, again, exploring this idea of how to pay for a wellbeing economy. But no, yeah, so that's us going to take a break for those of us that are here in person. I just want to thank everybody who's been able to come this afternoon, including those people who have joined online. So particularly thanks to Hope for presenting online as well, and to Alan and David for yeah, so thanks everybody. You're free to leave the Zoom. Go and actually get a real coffee.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Chance to speak today. My name is Keir. I'm from T1 International here. We are a global nonprofit. We work on insulin access and affordability around the world, and we are totally patient-led and grassroots-led. I am the global advocacy manager, so I help coordinate all of our volunteers and advocates around the world, and working on different policy and structural change. I also come to this work as a person living with type 1 diabetes, and I just began my PhD also on a diabetes related topic, so it is very much my passion and the breed diabetes. And yeah, so I want to explain a little bit more about T1 International to kind of set the scene of why I'm here talking and how this all fits in with public pharma. So like I said, we're a global nonprofit, and we try and train our advocates on how to implement and do this change in their country and their region, because we believe that they're the ones who know best what's going on, especially those who are living with diabetes. They have the experience and the expertise, and so we're there to support them and to get that global change. And we are totally funded by grants and donors, and we don't take any money from the pharmaceutical industry or device manufacturers. And this is to maintain transparency and also so that our work having to and we really, our vision is our biggest thing. We believe in a world where everyone who has diabetes can access everything they need to survive and achieve their goals. Not just, the goal should not just be surviving, it should be flourishing as well. Yeah, and we were founded as specifically type 1, but we do include all types of diabetes, anyone who's insulin dependent and needs glucose monitoring. A note on that one. And then I want to talk about the insulin types. I'm sure lots of you know, if you're in this space, that insulin is a very political, very debated medicine. It's one of the most expensive liquids in the world, despite it only costing $3 to $6 to manufacture, depending on the insulin type. And so this is why T1 International was founded, so that we can work on changing those policies to get better prices for people, better access for everyone around the world. And so we've been working on a lot of public pharma initiatives, mostly in the US, led by our community development director, Alison. And this kind of does include the question I asked earlier. It includes public-private partnerships and getting like some wins in that area. But my dream for our team is to really open up that public pharma for insulin production worldwide and get more access on that. And so something that I did over the past year was apply to get rapid-acting insulin analogs added to the World Health Organization's essential medicines list. So insulin, human insulin, was already on there. It's been on there for a couple of decades. But then analog insulins, as I'm over-explaining, let me know, but they most naturally mimic the insulin secretion of a person without diabetes. And they're the best treatment, doctors recommend it. For the longest time, we haven't had enough study or data to back up what patients already know. And so finally, long-acting analogs were added back in 2021 after 3 tries. And so we knew it was time to add rapid-acting as well. And so luckily, it only took us 1 try. We just found out in September. But this is really going to help lead the way towards that public pharma. And so some of the insulin context and why this really matters. There's only 3 companies worldwide that really control the insulin market, 96% by volume and 99% by value. And it really creates this insulated market that will not have natural price controls. And now we're seeing a lot of global shortages because big pharma is turning away from the medicines people need to survive and focusing on more profit-driven drugs. And so that's been really contentious in our space as well. And so every 2 years, starting in 2018, we do a survey, out-of-pocket expenses and rationing survey, to see people with type 1 diabetes, how much they're spending, if they're having to ration their insulin, if they can't afford their insulin at all. And so this is from our last iteration in 2024. You can find it on our website as well for more details. But basically, it's just showing that since we started this in 2018, the percentage of people rationing has nearly doubled. And this means that everyone all over the world, even high-income countries, are having to ration their insulin because they can't afford it. And so another one that's broken down into economic looting. And so the essential medicines list, it wasn't something that we thought is going to fix all. I think there was a lot of kickback that we got on this application. It was hotly debated. There's an article written against this in the Lancet, but we knew this was coming because it's all the arguments that have been made for a while, and also a lot of big pharma tactics. And so getting on to the essential medicines list was really the first step in a long-term plan, because if the points I put up here, it creates a lot of different opportunities for change in the long term, which can set us up for more sustainable solutions. And so we see it drives price reductions through global pressure, which we are seeing with long-acting analogs, which gives us hope. It creates better access in LMICs, helps support legal and policy reforms. It guides national health systems. So the EML is not a mandatory list because the WHO doesn't have any hard power, but 137 countries follow this list and use it to prioritize their national essential medicines list. So it creates a lot of pressure on countries to then try and make sure that they're providing insulin for the people in their countries who need it. And then this is where it really comes in, is encouraging generic production and local manufacturing. So as we're in a very uncertain time with US AIDS being defunded and closing in 2026, and a lot of other places following suit and really cutting funding, we need to turn to better solutions. And I think public pharma provides that solution, particularly with insulin, but then across all these areas of access to that. I think the next step, some advantages to really highlight within public pharma, is that it lowers costs through generic production, it helps improve supply chain stability, and most importantly, for TUN International, it prioritizes public health over profit. And so, like, what is the point of having innovation in medicine and all the production of medicine if it's not actually being used to help keep people alive, help people who need it the most? And we think public pharma provides that pathway and something that we really want to invest in. And so in the US, some initiatives have been going on. We just got kind of a win, if you will, with California. CalRx is now doing kind of a private-public partnership to provide insulin for about $10, I think, per box for patients, which is a really big win, especially in the United States. But it's not enough, and it needs to be global. So some implementation strategy pillars, if you will, that I kind of came up with for the World Health Assembly side event that PHM organized, is that we need to focus on policy and political commitment. So making sure that national formularies and those who are making policies are going to commit to this, because if we don't have buy-in from the government and those who are the power of the structure within a country, then we're not going to get further. We not only need to convince them, but I think as a lot mentioned too, we need to convince people that this is a good thing as well. And then we need to focus on manufacturing capacity, whether that's investing in new infrastructure or expanding existing ones. Regulatory alignment, so following the regulatory pathways to make sure that everything's good, we can get through. And then financing the procurement, which is probably going to be very hard because of the current funding state of the world, but focusing on like full procurement, global funding, different initiatives there. And so these are very broad categories, obviously, but it's supposed to be that way so that we can have a finer detail in moving forward. And I think it's also quite applicable to lots of different medicinal areas. So, yeah, and I think just a good leverage point, which might help with collaboration and buy-in globally, is that public pharma can really be a key driver of universal health coverage and an important tool for achieving sustainable development. Everything is very intersectional, and I think there's a lot of different ways that we can tie it in and gain a lot of more collaborations and partnerships when we leverage this kind of point for both NCD and CD. And so, yeah, thank you very much for letting me speak. And
thanks. My presentation will be a little bit different. I think we're going to sort of take a step out. My background is not in health or pharmaceuticals. My background is in political economy and how political economy overlaps with forms of organisation. And my contribution today is going to be drawn on this book, Radical Abundance: How to Win a Green Democratic Future, written by me and two of my colleagues, Bertie Russell and Kai Heron. We're all part of a small organisation called Abundance, and the book draws on our experience of trying to create, to design, and then implement this thing, public-common partnerships. And I'll explain what that is later on. But in a way, it's a reversal. It's an attempt to reverse the effects of public-private partnerships. Put it that way. So I'm going to draw from this book. I've got good news for you. I've got some copies of this book for you to read later, for you to buy off me later. It's the sales pitch. I'm going to follow the book, and so I'm going to basically, the book is split into two parts. The first part is, an explanation of our analysis of the world and the problems in the world and why those problems are there. Then it presents a theory of transition of how we get from where we are now to somewhere else, basically. So that's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book proposes this new form of ownership and governance for assets, resources, services, and even industries, called public common partnerships. And so we introduce this in the abstract, and then we go through 3 different sectors where we've actually done some work to try to design and implement these. And those sectors are urban development, food systems, and more relevant to today, pharmaceutical production. And particularly, we were involved in a project in France where I'm trying to create pharmaceutical production facilities run on a public common partnership basis. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to draw on that. That's one of the latter chapters in the book. I'm going to draw on that experience, but I want to position that within our wider analysis, because it's hard for me to explain the strength of the strategy that we're proposing for pharmaceutical production if we don't position it within our wider analysis. So the book starts with quite a bold statement saying that we're facing a series of crises. Talk about a poly crisis, these sorts of things. But we make this argument there are 2 huge overdetermining crises that we face. One of them is going to be no surprise at all. It's unavailable crisis we face, extinction, it's a resource constraints. But the other huge crisis I think we face globally is long-term economic stagnation or secular stagnation. And the reason we would be concerned about that is because, particularly over the last sort of 15 to 20 years, most countries' growth models just are not able to produce the rising living standards for a wide enough section of the population to maintain social and political instability. So you may say, oh, well, there are other crises. There's incredible political volatility. A far-right party called Reform are leading in the polls at the moment. You have Donald Trump in America, etc. Huge political volatility, but that is baked that we can reduce that to an effect of long-term economic stagnation. These 2 crises, they compound each other because one of the effects of climate change, for instance, is to increase the cost of living for all sorts of reasons. The cost of olives has gone up massively because of droughts in southern Europe, etc. Those sorts of pressures will not go away. They will increase. They will increase the pressures on prices, etc., and the costs of everything. The solution to those 2 crises, ecological deterioration and economic stagnation, they seem to be in tension. They seem to pull apart. What would the obvious solution to economic stagnation is growth. We have a government in the UK in which they say we want to prioritise growth over everything. We're going to rip up regulations in order to get growth. The argument in the book is if you want growth, and the ecological conditions, the ecological constraints we have, and the current structure of our society. So one of the effects and one of the causes of economic stagnation is a shift towards rentier models of rentier business models, we can say that sort of thing, where rentier business models are where you extract rents from owning an asset or resource or owning an intellectual property, which of course is in pharmaceuticals. So we make this argument. Under those sorts of conditions, you just can't make an argument for just growth. You have to say, well, growth of what? Produced under what imperatives? That benefits who? And who bears the costs of that? What are the costs of that form of growth, basically? So if you want abundance, well, abundance of what? Produced under what imperatives is the argument. So in the first chapter of the book, we make this distinction. Oh, actually, I've got some slides. we make this distinction between what we call radical abundance and bullshit abundance. Bullshit abundance is always paired with artificial scarcity as our argument. So we have an abundance of stuff that we don't need and a scarcity of stuff that we do need. We make that argument through all sorts of terms, basically. But we can just look at the pharmaceutical sector. Of course, we've already heard about this. You can see artificial scarcity. There's a scarcity of generic medicines. There's a scarcity of investment into the medicines that we need. There's a bullshit abundance of investment into research, into evergreening drugs, etc., into new impotence drugs, these sorts of things. Bullshit abundance of what we don't need, and an artificial scarcity of what we do need. And we think that the dynamics that drive that are because the investment and the capitalism goes to what is comparatively most profitable, not just what's profitable, but most comparatively most profitable. And we think that that means that what gets invested in does not necessarily match up with needs. And we think that the current structure of capitalism exacerbates that tendency. Make that sort of argument. So that's that's sort of a really quick thing of these are the dynamics which are causing the problems in the world. I think the problem, the real question is, how do you get out of it? So the next bit in the book, it offers a theory of transition, basically, and any theory of transition or any project of transition, no matter what you're transitioning from, basically. So when people talk about transition, they quite often mean they're talking about green transition, and they're talking about we need to change the energy base of society. We think you need much more radical transition on that. You can change much more fundamentally. But whatever your task of transition, they face very common problems, basically. One of the problems is, one of the difficulties of transitioning to a new system is that we rely on the existing system for the things that we need to live, basically, which means that it implies that, therefore, a project of transition is to build up an alternative system at the same time as the existing system is existing. Those two systems quite often are in tension with each other, and eventually the process of transition is one subordinates the other. We would make this argument in the book about what we need to do. We need to limit and constrain the amount of economic activity that takes place under the logic of capital, and then expand the amount of economic activity that takes place under a different logic, a more democratic logic, where we decide what we need to invest in, basically. That's the argument. So that's the first sort of tension. We call that the problem of contested reproduction. It's one of in any form of transition, we think that that's this problem of contested reproduction. You've got two systems in competition with each other, building up over time. Is one of the problems we need to face. The other one is the other problem that we face at the moment is this on this slide here, which is a gap between what's necessary to do and what currently seems socially and politically possible to do. We always exist with a constrained sense of what it is possible to do socially and politically. And the problem at the moment is that there's a gap between that and what we need to do. I normally make this argument in terms of control of fossil fuel reserves, basically, where it's basically an objective social necessity to take control of fossil fuel reserves away from fossil fuel companies, but it is a political impossibility at the moment. But we could make that in terms of how do we transition the pharmaceutical sector, basically. Imposing regulations is incredibly difficult. The task of replacing big pharma with a public pharma system seems almost impossible, and the current sense of what's socially and politically possible. Therefore, we need to iteratively expand what is socially and politically possible to do, right? And there's only one, the key mechanism for that, the key factor in that is to expand what we call popular protagonism, which is you need to enroll people in projects which increase their ability to understand where they fit into the world and then act upon it collectively, basically. to be the collective protagonists in their own right and in history, something like that. Yeah. So these are. Yeah. And so we make this argument, contested reproduction, popular protagonism, and we think that in fact what we need to do is to put those two things together and have popular control over the key assets, resources, services that we need to live. And then we offer what we call a strategic wager. And we think that there's an institutional form which can help to address both of those two key elements of transition, which we call a public common partnership. So a public common partnership is an institutional form that democratizes the management and ownership of an asset or resource or a service. And the most easiest way to think about public common partnership is an attempt to reverse public-private partnerships. I was going to talk about public-private partnerships, but then it came up a little bit. And I think it is really essential to struggle over the social conditions that governments can impose on public-private partnerships. That's a real arena of battle, I think. But there's another way to try to understand what public-private partnerships are doing in the current moment. So public-private partnerships at the current moment are part of a reintroduction of industrial policy. And so they take the form of de-risking, where the government is de-risking private investment into the areas that it wants investment to go in. The way to understand that is that the state is regaining some sort of control over the investment function, over what gets invested in. And the neoliberalism, that was one of the core tenets of neoliberalism, was that economic decision-making, and in particular investment decisions, should be insulated from democratic pressure. Right? That's one of the key tenets of neoliberalism. What we are seeing in response to these twin crises I mentioned earlier is a return of industrial policy, which opens up a new era of political contestability, I think. So one of the arguments we can make around public common partnerships is, like, instead of the state de-risking, and so de-risking just means that you, through some sort of mechanism, you take away the risks of private investment, you socialize the risks, as the profits of government, we're not used to that. So the argument is this, we should be making demands that instead of the public de-risking private ownership, we should be demanding that the public de-risk common ownership of assets, resources, and so forth. The public common partnerships, this is a sort of like abstract sort of governance structure of how a public common partnership could work. We're asking the public to de-risk this, so they would probably want some sort of say on the governance of an asset or a resource. We also think that the employees should have some sort of input into this. If we're thinking about a pharmaceutical factory, of course, which I'm going to mention a little bit later, the employees, I think, should have some sort of say. But in addition to that, we want to add a third category, which is, we call it the common association. And the common association is basically, it's usually drawn from the local community, who are organized in a democratic fashion in order to be able to feed into the governance of an asset, resource, or service. We don't want to just democratize the governance of these things. What we're really, really interested in is the investment fund that I mentioned earlier. We want to democratize investment decisions. And so in this sort of structure, you can see there's like shared ownership, etc. But a portion of the surplus produced by an asset, resource, or service goes to the common association, who then democratically deliberates about what that will be invested in. The money goes there, the surplus goes there after sort of debts have been serviced, etc., etc. We're trying to sort of insulate democracy, democratic decision-making from the influence of finance and capital, just to reverse engineer that insulation of economic decision-making from political democratic pressures, the reversal. One of the things one of the stipulations you could make so that's a form of participative budgeting, basically. But participative budgeting with surplus that arises from assets and resources we own, rather than directly from the public. One of the stipulations you could make about that participative budgeting is that one of the tasks you'll be set is to expand the democratic economy. So this is this idea here this very confusing picture, is that perhaps actually the knowledge and the surplus from one public-common partnership could go to help start or facilitate the next public-common partnership. Perhaps the surplus of knowledge from that could go to help start the next. What we're trying to do here is to build in a sort of self-expansive dynamic of the commons. Once again, you need that because capital has a self-expansive dynamic. You need to counter that. Yeah, sorry. So part of this is like to feed back again into that idea of like this conception of like an iterative transition where you're pushing forward what's possible at all times. One of the effects of this is that public-common partnerships could grow in size, right? But also as they grow in size, as they link up into chains and then perhaps circuits of the commons, as we call it, they can also separate themselves more fully from the logic of economic activity coordinated under the logic of capital, because you'll be enrolling people in mutually supported networks is the idea. So one of the places that we've tried to think this through and implement this is in pharmaceutical production. In 2021, there was a network formed in France called formed in France around trying to think through and then develop pharmaceutical productions as a commons, basically. It's a network of people who like health activists who started it, who struggle around common ownerships problems, but it soon expanded to include pharmaceutical engineers, pharmaceutical workers, quite a lot of them retired, etc., who were motivated, in fact, by the artificial scarcity of generic medicines and also the intellectual property rights over vaccines, etc. And then we were invited in 2022 to try to think through how this could be a public-common partnership. The idea would be initially that that it would be a pharmaceutical production facility which would produce generic drugs, and then develop over time into something which could do research and development. There were two sites which we were looking at, one in Romanville in Paris and one in Saint-Genis-les-Vals, which is just outside Lyon. So that three-part governance structure that I showed you in the abstract, this is what it looks like when we try to think about it through on a concrete, practical basis of this pharmaceutical factory in Lyon. Once again, the employees feed in, here's the local authority who are de-risking this project. And the Common Association is fulfilled here by the Common Health Association. So the Common Health Association, once again, it's people drawn from the local community who in a way stand in for generic patients. Right? One of the interests you might want to feed into this is patients of the medicine that you're producing. That's a very difficult thing to form a democratic organization around because patients are spread around the world. But also if you change your production line, you then have to get a new community organized. It's not feasible. And in this case, the Common Health Association we're tasked with making public health interventions. And so one of the things that it opened up with this is a move away from a sort of biomedical form of conception of health, basically. In private production, the incentive is to maximize the use of the medicine. Here, some of the surplus is going, perhaps with insulin, for instance, to deal with the environmental causes of some of these conditions, or to reduce your market in some sort of way. It opens up a different perception of health, is what we would say. Oops. This box here, the Common Health Federation, is this is the sort of like a step up, a network up, because one of the things with pharmaceutical production is that you would not be. It doesn't make sense to just think about one pharmaceutical production facility on its own, even though you would start there. You're immediately drawn to think about, well, hang on, who makes the active ingredient for this medicine? Oh, that's only we need to get some sort of agreement in place, or Big Pharma will just buy them and put us out of business, basically. So we started to think through the idea of like, well, what would a network form look like, basically? And so in these things called SCICs, so these would be these public common partnerships, commonly owned pharmaceutical production facilities. But immediately, these are private, small to medium-sized pharmaceutical producers who would be enrolled into a network if they agree to a certain charter of practice. You get enrolled into the benefits they get if they're enrolled into a network of mutual support, basically, and de-risking of costs, etc. So that's as far as we got. We went quite far actually with a factory in Lyon, and we were talking to the workers there. The factory was actually getting it already got close to bankruptcy and had been bailed out with a public-private partnership agreement. It was getting closer to bankruptcy again. In French law, there's a mechanism where a company gets to bankruptcy where the commercial court could give that over to the workers, and there's a form of cooperative called a SCIC in France which can allow other parties to join. Unfortunately, recognising the problem of artificial scarcity of generic medicines, Macron did a big bailout of this company, and so our project there came to a halt for now. But we hope to return to it one day. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that we learned from studying policies and interventions to address vaccine equity. And basically, this is building on work that I did with Toby, who's in the room. You've got the paper, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but just to say our work's now funded by the Finnish Research Council. This is part of the work we did to build the case for looking at trade agreements and their role in protecting public health and assuring universal health coverage. Just to put on my conflict of interest slide, to say that I'm involved in a number of organisations, some of which will be useful for joint working going forward, but also so I'm not going to cover things that people have already said. We've already started to talk about the role of and potential of this approach in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and the importance of the essential medicines list. So thanks for that. I'm going to say something about the things that we learned and the potential that we have. So just to kind of start that conversation, one of the things that we found in looking at vaccine equity and the hundreds of policy documents we looked at was significant evidence of policy capture and a lack of any policy gaze on the issues that we're discussing. Inequalities, vaccine equity really wasn't on the agenda. Things were seen as being ethically neutral, and with an awful lot of work going on to address technical things in terms of mitigating harms, rather than thinking about how do we think about things differently through collaboration, and how do we look at the determinants of vaccine equity, which are linked very much to the agenda that you have here. There are opportunities through the essential medicines list and through a number of the pieces of legislation that established national health systems, particularly in Europe, but also in, for example, Latin American countries and in some parts of Africa, to enshrine access to medicines and vaccine in law, because there's normally a clause there. There certainly is a clause that could be applied in the NHS Act in Scotland. I'm going to say something about public tasks for private companies. As was mentioned earlier, America is one of the few countries that actually has and used earlier in the pandemic the requirement to hand over intellectual property for public benefit in the event of an emergency. However, once the vaccines were developed, that right was not then used, and it should have been used as vaccine for public use. And then I'm going to say something about how we can build on existing right to health regulation, why vaccine equity? It's obviously a really good concrete case for us to think about this. We were thinking about it in the context of an emergency. We were learning that the public health rights that were established through the Doha Agreement did not work in practice. despite beautifully crafted calls from countries around the world that public health was not protected, access to medicines weren't protected, and you can see the variation across income groups. And this is from 2022, this is just about priority groups. This is not universal access to vaccines for COVID, this is just booster sufficiency for priority groups. And countries that were squeezed, variation across, but if you think about upper middle income countries, which include European countries, if you think about South Africa, where there was partnership as part of the vaccine development, involvement of those populations in R&D, they did not get access at a reasonable price. So whatever it was, didn't work. We found this vicious cycle of policy capture, vaccine inequity, and then dumping and waste. So what has happened in terms of essential foods, etc., in the States, this is just a continuation of something we've seen already. Public funding doesn't mean public access, but we could think about how that could change. So what we identified were a number of intervention points, and I think it's possible through our discussions to map actions against those intervention points, and then to start to build up that agenda for action. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, just to say that actually these are opportunities for us to think about. I'm happy to discuss in more detail. So we can think about what are the existing public tasks of private companies. So if we start with emergencies, pharmaceutical companies, as part of their production of medicines, make nasty chemicals, either in the factories that make the medicines or in other bits of their supply chain. Remember that Seveso's parent company, the Seveso disaster, the parent company was a pharmaceutical company, Rossi. So they have a requirement to participate in disaster prevention and response already in law in Scotland, in UK, and in Europe, and in other countries. So that is something that could be expanded in terms of the response to future epidemics and pandemics. And there is a line in the pandemic agreement that after a lot of wrangling opens the door to that. So it is just a slightly open door, but it is a position of possibility. In the NHS, and that's what the East Community Risk Register is showing you, because it's showing you that there is a pharmaceutical company in Edinburgh that is part of that requirement to respond to disasters. This picture is the building in Dundee that is an NHS Scotland building that manufactures medicines for Scotland, for research, for exceptions, and for unlicensed medications. It's very small scale. It was ramped up and filled some gaps during the acute phase of the pandemic, but it exists. It is an example, and it could open the door again to expansion. So all of the kind of agreements that exist to enable this to happen on this scale could be expanded. On the right-hand side is a picture of two possums, and that's to think about the rest of the supply chain. Because many decades ago, two companies were spin-offs from public research, initially from the Department of Health when before devolution in Scotland, so this is many decades ago, and what they produced was assistive technology. So it was initially completely public funding, but it was only spun off into the private sector as a collaboration with quite tight governance when it was necessary to scale up. So Possum and Selectascan were the original companies producing assistive technology. So there's an opportunity there to think about, hang on, it's in living memory that we did this in the public sector. And we could think about the other bits of the supply chain and the other bits of technology. There are more recent examples that I can talk about later. And then the final is this door that is open in terms of our existing public-private partnerships through what's called the Common Understanding in Scotland, which are the rules by which pharmaceutical companies have to work in order for collaborations to happen. Now, there are a set of requirements in terms of having formal written agreements, in terms of the NHS in Scotland retaining aspects of intellectual property, common licensing, and so on. But they could be more tightly enforced, and they could be worded more strictly. So as with all of these documents, the wording is a bit vague. In practice, what it means is you have to have an NHS Scotland Central Legal Office agreed contract in order to undertake this kind of work. And that has a range of responsibilities that comes with it. That are often not fully implemented in terms of workers' rights, in terms of intellectual property and so on. But again, it's a door that's slightly ajar that could be opened more widely. And then when we're thinking more globally, when we think about public pharma, some of the advantages are health technology assessment. That has to take place in the public sector in order to assure the appropriate governance, that things are effective, that you have the appropriate data in terms of long-term monitoring and minimizing the risk of harm. There, unfortunately, in the US, there is only one HTA facility in the US. All of the other ones that look as though they're in America are actually in Canada. It's just the blobs are not quite large enough to get the whole globe on. It has to take place in the private sector. You have to have governance. You have to have a way of managing the entry of new interventions and removing old ones. And remember that these, when we think of health technology assessment, pharma is part of that multi-technology assessment that happens in every country. So there are opportunities there. The other is that the public sector has to do the protection of confidentiality, and it has to have the oversight of patient data. So that's not something, again, the US is trying to privatize that. That's not something that really anyone, I think, in most of the world would agree to have outside the public sector. The door that is open here is what's talked about as post-marketing surveillance. Actually, now most clinical trials require a long-term cohort study attached to them to assure the public and governments that the risk of rare but catastrophic events can be picked up early, because we know from history, recent history, what happens if you don't do that. And so the requirement for these to be partnerships between the health service and universities, rather than being something that's controlled by companies, is really, really important, because we've seen the failures of the ones that were controlled by companies through things like the mesh technology, which was used for repairing incontinence in women after childbirth. So there are lots of these different examples of failure that mean that this is, again, potentially an open door. And it's one that the public, I think, would really support. In terms of shrinking, so in terms of open doors, that's one bit. The next bit is the shrinking the market bit. So we have a commitment, particularly in Scotland, in terms of optimizing medicines use, which means minimizing ineffective use. And it gives us a door to close against the wellness industry, which is where pharma will go if we try to close down regulated pharma. So we need to keep that in mind. In Scotland, prescriptions are free at the point of need. I can't see the public standing for that changing, frankly. So that's a really important thing. We have a public health approach to pharmacy in our legislation, regulation, and in the training of our professionals. We have things called pharmaceutical care plans. So medicines are not seen as isolated things. They are part of a care pathway. They're integral to prevention, treatment, and care. So again, I have seen an NHS chief executive in tears because of the cost of cancer medicine, and because that meant that other parts, essential parts of that care pathway were being squeezed. That happened behind closed doors. The person's now retired, but actually it's a really important principle. And again, something I think that the public would support. We also have a joint primary and secondary care formulary. It's just a picture of one of them. So we have these principles around optimizing medicines use for the benefit of people. We have a cadre of professionals that are interested in what matters to people as part of their professional role. So again, there are these opportunities to shrink the market to what is absolutely necessary. And then we need to think about moving from emergencies and exceptions towards equity. So we know about the harms associated with not regulated health technologies appropriately, which is why we now have good arrangements. Similarly, with medicines, we know that you can only share health and determinants data appropriately if it's in the public sector. And I've shown you, I hope, a range of opportunities that we could map against the pathway to start to think about action. So while public pharma may seem like a big dream, start small with things that I've identified as potentially open doors, build, collaborate, show the collaboration, show the benefit, keep going, and then we can start to think about how we can move towards reducing the inverse care law in access to essential medicines and vaccines. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is the right moment for us to make a clarification about the objective of this final session. Because as you all know, this is part of this People's Health Assembly that we're organizing during the whole weekend. And this session specifically is a session of the International People's Health University, IPHU. And the idea is that the People's University is not just a place where, such as other universities that we know, you sit there and just listen and learn, and then you just know more than you knew previously. So the idea here is really to put everyone on the same page, and from here, build together the way forward, what to do. What's the practice that we can build together from now on? And I think this last 30 minutes could be more focused on that. And what does it mean in practice? From our perspective, at least, it's a two-way collaboration. First, you from different countries in Europe and beyond, you can bring your own experiences to our discussions of public pharma. And we from PHM, who are more involved with this project in specific, can see how we can collaborate from now on. So you can bring this knowledge that you just absorbed here today to your own countries, to your own communities, to see how we can advance that in practice. We know that not everyone will be interested in pursuing this specific task, this specific cause, but you certainly know someone who might be interested, or maybe you can accommodate that between your own causes. So this is the idea. Of course, 30 minutes will not be enough, but the idea is a start of conversation, and keep doing this type of event even in your own countries. Just let's keep in touch about this, because the most important thing here is to build the movement, build the real political power to achieve public pharma, and not only know that it's necessary and someone should do that. You know, we are the people here in this room who could build this in practice. So the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot to all speakers. I'm Nicholas. I'm from Belgium. I think and it's also related to what we discussed in the first part of the sessions about broadening, about having more allies and so on. I think an easy tendency that we often have is to stay between ourselves in our own circles of more or less convinced people. And it's not always easy to reach out to new people. And a positive experience that I've had, it's now a few years ago, it's back when I was a student representative, but it was at uni with the local students union, have to invite like a few professors and people talking about, it was not public pharma itself, it was like the challenges of pharmaceutical industry. It was a bit hidden, but the idea was, yeah, to find the right threshold, to find the right speakers, to find how to make it sexy, how to make it interesting for students or for doctors of the nearby hospital. But I think it's something we have to really force ourselves to do, is to reach out to the rest of the people, all of our colleagues in the healthcare sector, in amongst the students and so on, because that's, yeah, as you just said, that's the only way to actually gain some power on the issues. And so if anyone has like good experiences on that, I would be very interested to hear about it. Thank you.
Hi. I really enjoyed those three talks, and just thinking about the ways that they might inform each other, and especially sort of the public commons partnerships that you're talking about. I wondered if, Alison, you could speak to anything that came up when you were listening to public commons partnerships in terms of the work that we've done and that you just spoke about, and the open doors. I don't know if that stimulated any thoughts with you about how to take next steps with those.
Thanks very much. I think one of the things, particularly in Scotland, is that there are a number of pieces of legislation at the moment that could be used to create public commons partnerships, and I suspect that some of those are being used in some of the kind of things I described. It is really important from the work that we did that you are very clear that you're in the non-competitive space in order that you don't end up falling foul of trade agreements. But I think that's entirely possible to say this is outside of that. This is not for profit. This is something that is not, it's not in the competitive space, it's owned by the population. So a public commons partnership is owned by the population and its institutions, and we have legislation in Scotland that would allow some of those things to happen in terms of buildings and in terms of the kinds of joint ventures that you've described. And I suspect that careful scrutiny of legislation in your own countries may find similar sorts of opportunities. And I can think, for example, even if you were looking in Belgium, I think in Gwent, I think there's probably an opportunity there because of the work they've done with the local population over decades and decades to create a climate where that might be possible. And there will be other, I'm sure there are other examples that I just don't know about. The French example is also really, really important because there's, looking at the French language literature around the pandemic, there are conversations that happened in French that didn't happen in English around the role of the government not serving the people but serving industry. That I think there's an opportunity to build on that. So I guess those would be the things that I would be thinking about.
Anyone else?
Hello everyone, I'm Lothian, Milburn. I have a question to Keir, point here about the somewhat complicated map that you showed about BCPs. I'd like to know what would be, or if you could explain a bit further, what would be like the regulatory mechanism in which this wouldn't go into or spiral towards I mean, what the common private partnership model to this model, what would be that thing that would let it, you know, stay in its pure form, so to speak? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll maybe talk from the UK context. So in the UK context, there's a legal form called Community Benefit Society. And that's a form that we usually use when we're thinking through public common partnerships in the UK. And there you define the community benefit, you define the community benefit basically. And so that's a sort of legal mechanism whereby you cannot go beyond that into private profit basically, because it's a, you know, the aim of the joint enterprise is to benefit the community in the ways that you've set out basically. So you can have stipulations there. You can have stipulations around one of the community benefits that will occur would be perhaps public health interventions, perhaps expanding the democratic economy, etc., etc. So there would be legal mechanisms whereby the practice of one of these public common partnerships would be tied into that. It gets more complicated, but the other diagram where we try to think through how you would form a network. So it's part of the reason why you try to form a network in quite rapid fashion would be to try to change the power of the public bodies in negotiation with private producers. Because like in the UK at the moment, of course, right there, the public sector has no power to negotiate, as we're finding out now, because there's no alternative producer. So even just the vague idea that there could be an alternative mechanism by which pharmaceuticals could be produced. In fact, you know, the threat that we will actually put big resources into a network of public-private partnerships, that just changes the power that public negotiators have. But the way you get to that would be to include small to medium-sized private pharmaceutical producers. And we would try to think through how we would draw up a charter in which they could benefit from mutual support of this network, but be tied into the ethos of that network, if you know what I mean. And we didn't get so far in that, but we did go and talk to some small to medium-sized French pharmaceutical owners of French pharmaceutical factories, and they were very interested because, of course, they get a very bad deal in the big pharma sector of the pharmaceutical sector. But that's where it gets really complicated when you step outside these common ownership projects and you try to include private, small to medium-sized private pharmaceuticals. But you wouldn't want to do that because you want to be able to present at least the threat of an alternative model so that you change the hand of the public negotiators.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I just wondered if we know that the next big pandemic that's going to affect mankind and protein system. We know there's hardly any new antibiotics in production. And for people that are involved with the group already have antibiotic resistance, it very sharpens your mind as to what treatments are actually out there. We know there's antibiotics and bacteriophage treatments that also happens. And I just wondered if anybody in the room knows of anywhere that we can kind of link in to try and help those that are currently, you know, running out of options really. And you know, we went to a conference last year and we were at an ABSAP principle, and it is very concerning for those of us that have been put in that situation through no fault of our own. But yet, in the UK, many there's not much NHS help out there. You've either got to get really, really sick and they might give you compassionate grounds, or else you've got to go and fund private healthcare. I had to get out down to a specialist in London was really, really difficult, and I had to wait till it came very, very early. So it was just really, how can we try and help that kind of cross-border treatment and also wider national treatments for patients. So.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm part of the People's Health Movement in Scotland, and my friends will be in People's Health Movement with this kind of observation. But I don't want to take away from this very individualistic, hugely important issue. But what I wanted to bring to the conversation was the root causes, if you like, of the situations. I think what we've discussed here are the fact that there are alternatives to the system that we have at the moment. There are many positive alternatives to capitalist market-based system. But what often there's this corporate air capture of the policy environment, of the public imagination. And so I work in a university and I teach community education, which is a lot of it is based on the writing of Paulo Freire, Brazilian, the idea of critical conscientization. And this leads you into discussion around issues like agnotology, so the production of ignorance, how certain, epistemic violence takes place where certain knowledge is held back from public knowledge. And for me, I think these discussions need to be framed within that context of an agreement that we need a post-capitalist future. We need a decolonial future. We need a feminist future. And without that broader picture, my friend Sue and I did a thing for the Green Party some years ago before we lost faith. In which we were trying to diversify the kind of membership, etc. But there was somebody that gave a presentation there, and they said we basically need to do everything. We need to do it all at once, and we need to do it now. So for me, within this context of these really important issues, I'm just interested in perspectives on how we broaden out the understanding that this situation was never either we wanted to be sustained, whether the planet wasn't collapsing, whether there wasn't, massive investment in militarization, etc. None of these things are sustainable or desirable. So it's just that kind of tipping point, that transformative paradigm shift that sometimes doesn't take decades to happen, but can happen in a much shorter space of time. Thank you.
I'd just like to answer that question in a different sort of way. I mean, yes, I agree. We need to do everything all the time, and we can't stop. But I think because we're the audience that we are today, and we've been listening to this very important issue, and it has been a wonderful set of presentations. I think we need to discuss to what extent we think this is a mobilizing issue. I mean, is this something we can reach people through different routes? And is this something from which we can both tackle the issues of medicine inequity, but then lead on to some of the intersectional issues that we've also been referring to, or is it not? I mean, because People's Health Movement Scotland, we're going to look at all the different elements, all the different tomorrow when we consider our manifesto, but we are small like everybody else, and we've got to think about where to put our energies and where to put our priorities. And I just would welcome people's thoughts and views as to whether this is a sufficiently stimulating issue for people to organise and get involved around.
Well, I'm going to pick up that point and then point that you need. And I guess there's something for me about for the broader people's health movement, how much of this is collaboration rather than, and it's tailored specific interventions into a broader public pharma movement from the people's health movement, or is it collaboration? I think that's something that's but it links to the point that you made around antibiotic resistance, where the drivers of antibiotic resistance are loss of biodiversity, climate change, and forced movement of people, plants, and animals. And so public pharma links to that because of the need to reduce the volumes of medicines required because we're doing things differently. From an individual point of view, there are issues about the way that the mechanisms that are intended to protect people sometimes fail them. The broader people's health movement, because we often see individual stories as being somehow different to the population, because we were all taught that the drivers of individual needs are not the same as the drivers of population needs. And I would challenge that by saying individuals can give us their views as sentinels. They are the tip of the iceberg often of a deeper problem that needs to be tackled. And so when we look at the needs of populations, we need to be thinking about what are the people telling us the issues are. And if that's distorted because of these issues about productive ignorance, then we need to tackle that informally. So I think there are specific things that we can do to improve the system, but actually do need to address these fundamentals. And one of the fundamental things is about changing the relationships in we have with individuals and communities that are open.
Maybe so. I think definitely, yeah, it is something we should be mobilizing around. And kind of I'll answer your question well first. I think it's something that's becoming more and more evident that we can't ignore the cost from the economic side of things, but also just of the sheer amount of people losing their lives to inaccess because of price, because of shortages. And I think public pharma, focusing on health really gets to an epicenter of different things intersecting with it, right? And so health can cover so many different areas, from sanitation to food, access to medicine. And I think we're headed we are in a decaying world. We've hit a point of consumerism and capitalism not stopping, and it's really curating a lot of people, a lot of countries. And I think if we don't be bold and definitive on, yes, we need to mobilize around this, then we're just going to keep seeing those consequences at an exponential rate. And like how we do it in theory, and it's going to be obviously a lot harder in practice, is and something that we practice at Team International is there is power in numbers. And so you just really have to be persistent and relentless in reaching out to people and collaborating and motivating them into action. And I think it starts really intrinsically. So how do you play to that autonomy within people to want to do something? And like we have varying successes. We do mobilizations to train people to how to write letters to policymakers, how to tell their story for advocacy, to garner attention and get that visibility out there. And sometimes they work really well and our attrition rates are quite low and people participate. And other times our attrition rates are very high and people don't engage. And I think that can be pretty hard to see when you're the one working on organizing these things, trying to do it, but it's all the more reason to keep doing it. And so I think mobilization doesn't really have a definite end and you just have to keep going. But I do think the more hard yeses we get that this is something we should mobilize around, the better chance we have at making long-term change.
Yeah, I just want to link up a couple of comments actually. Whether health is something which is something which is mobilizable around, whether that's something that will mobilize people, and then this, well, we need to do everything. And I think health is an issue that does lead to we need to do everything, basically. I'll explain that in terms of the public-common partnership thing and this idea. The reason we're so interested in getting these protected spaces where people deliberate and come to collective decisions about investment is because that's where you negotiate and produce collective interests, basically. But more than that, there's a lot of things we can do with this surplus. What do you value most? What do you prioritize most? That's where you create collective values which can then guide investment decisions to replace economic value as the thing that guides economic decision making, etc. We've done urban development projects where we've had these common associations, and we've done workshop with people. And with urban development, they tend to think in terms of assets and perhaps local services, etc. When we started to think through these common health associations, when people are tasked with making public health interventions, like that could be anything. They could be thinking about food, they could be thinking about transport, they could be thinking about all of the things that go into life. It is an issue that opens up onto everything, basically. That's what I wanted to say.
Hi everyone, I'm Matteo, I'm from Italy. I am a doctor. I want to say that maybe the most important thing that we can do is to create this shared awareness about this topic. And the most important things to do in this direction is maybe to create a common presentation about all this topic. So what is a public pharma? What does it mean now to not have a public pharma and to go outside and to share all this information with the people that we meet in our common places that we go through in our everyday life. And maybe if we have a common presentation, a common script, I don't know, and then we heard this to all the people, and maybe then we calibrate this with all the specific people that we meet. Maybe this can be a concrete thing that we can start to do. Then, of course, there are a lot of steps to achieve the goal, but the first thing, in my opinion, is to start to share this awareness with people.
Well, maybe now we can also make a vision from PHM perspective, not how comments. Well, first, from our perspective, yes, it's a big yes that it's a mobilizing topic, but it depends how we approach it. For example, if you go to people and say, look, we are in a new liberal world and then it's a problem since the 80s and etc. I doubt that it's going to work, right? So this is not the discourse that we are looking for. What I see working already is, look, have you experienced already drug shortages? Have you experienced high prices? Or are you worried about the climate change and how big pharma is polluting our rivers and et cetera, and how it's causing, for example, the antimicrobial resistance? So this type of concrete things help us to create awareness and a mobilizing force around that. And what's happening already is that these problems, they are already mobilizing people and political parties and unions, etc. But the problem is that they are omitting the public farm alternative. So everywhere you see this being debated, is a hot topic now. And then our role is to say, look, give more money to the private sector cannot be the only solution. We have here also another possibility, and it's powerful. So we have already many journalists and other people from the media who were reaching out to us and said, look, it was not in my mind that it could be something. So alternative to giving more money to Sanofi or to Gilead, et cetera. So this is something that's already working. We can see just treatment example, we can see T1 international example, et cetera. So this is a pragmatic point on narrative. But now I would like to share a little bit what PHM is doing in practice, what is our plan. We are in the second year of our project, Public Pharma. And then the first year was more defining a concept. What is public pharma for us? Why it's necessary? And everything that you saw today, we also have a policy brief that we shared by mail with you all. So it was the first year. The second year was more building alliances and partnerships and also our coalition, et cetera. So it's ongoing. We believe that we achieved our immediate goals, our milestones. But then in 2026, our plan is to become more concrete. And this is what I would like to share with you. That is, we have to be more clear how we can establish, protect, and expand public pharma in the real world. And it will depend on you and the people you know to say, look, in Italy, we have this institute in Florence that, so it already exists. Are we fighting to expand its mandate? Are we fighting to protect it from budget cuts? What is the next step? But someone else from Sweden can say, look, we already have this one, and then they are focusing on this and that. We could also focus on MRA, antimicrobial resistance. I hate this. IMR. Yeah, perfect. And then it's a good example. Or in my country, there is no public farm initiative. So how can we establish a new one? And then to be concrete, since we are not going to conclude our conversation today, the first day of our incursion on this broader discussions. First step, the easiest one, follow us on social media. So the Public Pharma for Europe Coalition. So you can stay tuned and share with people who would be interested. If you want to go a step further and be really, really radical, you can also take some flyers with me and take it to your family and friends and share with that. But the most important and my final message is, wherever you are now is the place where you can influence. So if you or your organization is focused on high-level advocacy at WHO, etc., try to include this on the agenda of the organization. If you are a researcher, if you're a teacher, if you are anything, you can try to include this in your classes, you can try to include this in your research, you can try to share this somehow. So the idea of this meeting here, at least from our perspective, is to create synergies, because we are very aware that one of the sides of neoliberalism is a heavy workload. So no one here is asking for you to add another layer of work. The thing here is, how can we find synergies so we can share our workload? So if you know that someone is doing a PhD research on this topic, but you are an activist and you could provide data to this person and etc., it's a way for us to collaborate. So academia, activists, high-level advocacy, grassroots movements, we all can find synergies and meet each other where we are right now. This is the role of this meeting and of the other meetings that we will for sure organize in the future, and you are invited to suggest the next steps and ideas of places and focus and stakeholders that could be included. So this is really, it's not just a slogan, this is really a collective effort, and this is the only way to move forward with this agenda. So I would like to thank you all for joining us. And I think we are on time, right? So, maybe you want to
Finish early.
yeah. So